All right, welcome back. So our final session for today is Big Data and Cybersecurity, ensuring technology remains an asset, not a liability. And our panel today, for this evening, or this late afternoon, will be moderated by John Godfread, who is the NAIC Secretary Treasurer and the Commissioner of the other Dakota, North Dakota. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, John, you are still the world record holder for tallest elected politician. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yes.
It's a big deal.
One thing going for you. And John will be joined by Dorothy Andrews, Senior Behavioral Data Scientist and Actuary at the NAIC, Domhnall Cullinan, Director, Insurance Supervision, Central Bank of Ireland, Tracie, Grella, Global Head of Cyber Risk Insurance, AIG, and Peter Kochenburger, Associate Clinical Professor of Law and Executive Director, Insurance Law LL.M program at the University of Connecticut Law School. So please welcome John and our panelists.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Gary, and welcome, panelists. Thank you. We are the last panel of the day, so we're standing between you and the networking reception, I think, that comes afterwards. But it's really a good follow-up after the panel, the innovation panel we just had. A lot of the questions are going to be somewhat similar, I think, but we get a different viewpoint from our panelists up here, so it'll be nice kind of to follow that up. And obviously the things that are driving innovation is big data. It's clearly kind of becoming the backbone of our industry and the access of how consumers interact with the industry as well. As a way of background, just some of the background some of the things that the NAIC has been taking on. We did pass the artificial intelligence principles. That was done in August of 2020. We've continued our work down that road with a private passenger automobile survey. We'll be doing surveys in other lines of insurance to really kind of inform the work that we're doing as the NAIC of, again, I call it problem scoping, of how do we figure out what the usage, how deep it's going, and where it's being used. So that's some important work to continue. And also on cybersecurity, we've got our cybersecurity working group that, among other things, will be creating the cybersecurity incident response plan that'll help us address cybersecurity incidents with all of our licensed entities. And we'll obviously continue to monitor the cybersecurity trends. So we've got a great panel. You guys all know how to use Slido, I think, by this point. I will give a shout out. Their bios are in the program, so I encourage you to look at that if you got a chance. But we'll be looking for your questions as they come up. So we're going to jump right in. Dorothy, as a behavioral scientist, can you provide your perspective on how the use of data and technology is impacting the consumer experience with insurance products? And to add on to that, what is their awareness level for the consumer around their usage of big data?
So I think, big data, AI, ML is in fact improving the consumer experience in a lot of ways. You can use your cell phones to take pictures of your cars when you're in a car accident and get your claims processed a lot quicker. We have wearable devices that companies are using to get people to engage in healthy activities and get fit, monitor heart rate. We have computer vision models that can take aerial photos of roofs and give some idea of what the condition is. And that's also saving money. We also have computer simulations of storm events, and as opposed to having to experience a storm event, we can now simulate storms and understand how they behave in different types of areas with the help of natural scientists. But with all of this type of technology, you can examine it and see where biases can enter into the process and create a bias impact for consumers. And that's the thing I think we have to really start to focus more on as we bring new technologies on board. How is the consumer going to be impacted? Because I think the positive transformation of insurance is going to depend on ensuring that AI and ML doesn't harm consumers. And when we look at these processes, biases can enter the data. There's like three basic ways. It can enter the data, it can enter the algorithm, and it can enter the implementation. And often there isn't enough attention paid to the implementation. We build these algorithms, and they have a lot of fancy mathematics behind them. And then oftentimes what you see, they're put in the hands of people to make decisions who don't have as much insights into what's going on in the black box. And so, they're not able to say, well, in this situation, the result that the machine is giving me is not applicable. So we really need to have more controls around how it's being implemented and making sure people are implementing it as intended, and that they can understand where the red flags are when they're when they look at different cases and applying these types of models. As far as consumer awareness, I think some consumers are aware. I don't think nearly enough of them are aware. I think consumers understand what an algorithm is from, mostly from their experience with social media. But when it comes to insurance, insurance is very technical. Most people don't understand it. They just know they need to have it. And I think, and there is some research that is starting to emerge that talks about how consumers feel about certain variables being used in, used to rate their insurance, for example. And, I think if we were to ask consumers, what would you want to do about some of these variables? Because some of them are not very intuitive, although they may be highly correlated with risk. In my opinion, it's not enough to just have correlation. There should be some type of rational reason for why a particular variable is associated with your level of risk. And I don't think we're spending enough time on that piece as well. So if we want that positive transformation of insurance, we're going to have to be able to bring the consumer along, gain their trust, make sure they understand what's happening, so that they can also make an informed decision. Because I feel that without their awareness, we are in fact undermining consumer autonomy in decision making. And I think that's probably a pretty serious issue.
Yeah, and I think you touched on it a little bit at the end, the trust factor, right? I mean, it's not going to be the regulators that are going to be pushing the need for transparency in the end, because it's going to be something's going to happen somewhere down the road. A consumer group or consumers are going to be upset because, maybe not even because of the variable that was used, but because they didn't know that it was being used.
Right.
And so Peter, I'm going to turn it to you a little bit as our resident law professor up here. What some of the legal issues around that transparency issue, can you talk about that, and what can regulators do or supervisors do to help promote some of that or get through some of that?
Right. I think, and I certainly agree with everything Dorothy said, I think you raised, there's a number of risks. Privacy is one, I'll mention that in a minute, but also, to use a broad term, proxy discrimination and unfair discrimination, and not in the sense that we understand it, I'm not an actuary, but actuaries understand it, and others in the sense of actuarial fairness, that's important. But in the sense of overall fair, the factors being used. And this is where, and there's obviously political aspects to this, and whatever's going to happen with the hard disparate impact rule, we'll see. But certainly the idea that regulators, consumers, and the industry have to be concerned with more than simply an intent to discriminate. That's been illegal for 30, 40, 50 years. It's moving well beyond that as the multiplicity of factors increase and the potential for proxy discrimination. I think a disparate impact analysis looks different in insurance than it does elsewhere, but it's still the effects. And as you said a year or so, Commissioner, I always remember these things. And I like when I agree with it. But which is that we're really concerned with the effects, not necessarily. The intent's important maybe as to a penalty, but the effects of discrimination, unfair or proxy discrimination is really what we have to look at. The second thing is privacy, and here I think insurers are in a really tough role, in part because the nature of our regulatory system. We have 56 regulatory jurisdictions, all of which have, unless the federal government steps in, the ability to regulate uniformly, separately, and then obviously it would be some mix. So we have, the possibility of 56 insurance regulatory jurisdictions stepping in, but of course privacy is a broader issue than insurance, and state legislatures, including mine in Connecticut, will often legislate in ways they may not be thinking about insurers. They may include insurers with many other industries, but they're in there. They're in there because that's how the statute is written. So that's also trying to comply with, potentially conflicting, but even if not only insurance regulatory standards, but those imposed often by the states in other capacities. And then you add to that the fact that who's going to enforce these? I mean, you have the regulators, the state insurance regulators, especially to the extent that there are privacy laws that relate to more than simply insurers. State consumer protection, or more likely attorney generals will enforce it. There's the possibility of federal action, even without a federal standard. The CFPB hinted or suggested that in a different way a couple days ago. And there's always private litigation. I mean, that's how we enforce many laws in this country, is through a robust, it's a neutral term, private litigation system, in which even if the regulators either don't have jurisdiction or don't catch it, it's often actionable. And that's an inefficient way to regulate, but it's one that insurers know that they are also subject to. So they have it's a real complex issue for them.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, again, I still remember when we started talking down the road of the AI principles and some of those things that are really important for the insurance industry. The reality is something is coming in this space. It's either going to be we're either going to kind of be at the table or on the table, depending on where you want to be, and that could be from our international partners, it could be coming from the federal government here. And I'm frankly proud of the work that we've done at the NAIC, because I think we're at least still on the wave. Like we haven't fallen back behind. We're still moving forward, but I think that's the challenge at times when working with the industry and working with everybody, that we're acting either outside of the bounds, and as you look at the global marketplace, again, this is happening internationally, it's happening here federally even too. So Domhnall, before I get to you, I want to talk about, because sure, go ahead, Dorothy, please.
I just want to add that, algorithms, they don't know the difference between intentional or unintentional discrimination. They commit unintentional discrimination unless someone intentionally programs them to discriminate. But they can find patterns in data that end up being discriminatory, and that could be purely unintentional. So I think some of the definitions that we're working with to regulate algorithms and the use of algorithms and big data, we have to focus on this word of unintentional discrimination, because I think it's a very important component, because if we don't, then, companies will say, well, that doesn't apply to me because,
I didn't mean to do it.
yeah, I didn't mean to do it.
It all goes back, it's all rooted back in that consumer trust piece, right?
Yes.
If we get this wrong, consumers aren't going to trust it, and then we're going to probably have a bigger thing to unwind at the end of the day. So Dorothy, staying with you briefly, is in order to talk about this, in order to probably regulate this or provide guidance of some kind, we've got to have the skill set within the regulator community to do that. So I want to have you talk as a behavioral scientist, some of the difference that is coming in the traditional roles of actuaries, especially when you're looking at some of these models and these pricing of these products.
So, I like to say once upon a time, we had very deterministic ways of determining pricing. We had traditional variables, we had our formulas, and you just drop those traditional variables in the formula. And then we also had a lot of actuarial assumptions going into the mix. People started to become a little wary of actuarial assumptions, because two different actuaries could look at the same problem and come up with a different result. You're like, well, there's a lot of subjectivity in that. So then came along the generalized linear model, the GLM, which I think most people are probably familiar with. And it gave us this formula where we could just take variables, put them in a formula, and we would get out these factors, and then we could use addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and replicate insurance rates. And so that made people feel a little bit better. And we also have people now thinking of GLMs as, either gray boxes or white boxes, not black boxes, because they feel like people understand GLMs. And people are explaining a lot of insurance problems in terms of GLMs, even when they aren't using GLMs. So that's the other piece of it. But I think there's a danger in thinking that, GLMs are giving you, I mean, we know we know that GLMs are not giving us unbiased results. And even though the formulas may be easy to replicate, we need to be focused more on the data. We need to focus on how biases got into the data. We need to look at the outcomes and see who is actually being harmed by these algorithms and how do we go about measuring that. I feel that with some of the more complicated advanced statistical techniques that are being used, I don't think it's really necessary for everyone to understand what's in the black box. I think the focus really needs to be on the outcomes and who is being impacted by the outcomes. And then you can walk those outcomes back to the data and see what is it in the data that actually produced those outcomes. You can actually look at a data element and say, okay, how is this data element actually tied to some discriminatory policy or practice in society? And if you have a variable like that, then you're likely to get an outcome that's going to follow along that same path. So I think we've gotten a little too comfortable with some of these advanced statistical techniques, and because they're based on fancy mathematics, people are a little intimidated to ask questions about them. But I think we should be more focused on the outputs and the inputs to those black boxes.
Yeah, those are things that I can understand. I went to law school to avoid math, and now here I am. But Domhnall, I want to ask you about how are the regulators responding to the use of these tools, and are you finding that the reviewing these models require a different set of skills than traditionally?
Yeah. Before I answer your question, I just want to thank you and the NAIC for inviting me here. It's my first time in Washington. I was as giddy as a child on Christmas morning walking around yesterday seeing all these wonderful sites that we only see on the television. Probably just important for context to just represent the difference somewhat between Europe and what happens here in North America. So we don't in Europe have we're actually legislatively prohibited from intervening in anything to do with rates, which I think is obviously a slightly different situation we have here. But what insurers are required to do is act honestly, fairly and professionally and in the best interest of customers. Now that's enshrined in Ireland through something we call our Consumer Protection Code, but more importantly, perhaps it is also enshrined in European law. It's the general principle of the Insurance Distribution Directive, which applies to all insurers and insurance intermediaries. So when we go and look at, as part of our kind of ongoing supervision, we look at the models, we are looking at that through a prism of is there adequate governance, is there adequate risk management, is there adequate control in order to ensure that those principles of acting fairly, honestly and professionally in the best interest of customers are actually adhered to. Now to go back to something you mentioned earlier, that something is going to happen. Well, the something that happened in the Irish context and how we had to do something much more specific was in relation to price optimization. And it became quite a huge issue just before the pandemic actually. And I was, if anybody wants to laugh at my misery, they can go online and see me being berated at a parliamentary committee in relation to.
And that's on YouTube then?
It probably is, yeah. You'll find it on the Cullinan family website. And we had to conduct, so that there was this whole thing that people were being discriminated against because the length of tenure, etc. So we did a very, very deep dive into that, obviously involved our actuarial teams and our data science teams, and to try and really analyze what was a huge data gathering exercise, and then put it out in metrics that were useful, disseminate it out in metrics that were useful for policymakers and for the general public to understand. Now, what we absolutely identified as part of that was that there was an issue around discrimination in terms of price walking, the so-called loyalty penalty. So we are in the process now, we're going to bring out regulations in July, hopefully it'll be July or August, whereby that process, that will actually be banned now in the Irish market. Anybody trading or selling insurance in Ireland will be banned from using in non-life, home and motor, banned from using or banned from price walking. Another thing that we're doing at the moment as well is we've got assistance from the European Commission, the Director General for Reform, and we're carrying out a project on the use of big data in the ethics around it, I suppose, really, because that piece I just described only relates to the insurance market. But what you have to appreciate a little bit about Ireland is that we have an industry that writes 80 billion euro on premium, but 70% of that is actually written outside the jurisdiction. So while we might adopt with something domestically, we now want to see if there are things there that we can learn, that we can apply then in a wider context. So I think it's less about what are the skills you required previously and what the skills you require now. We're learning as we're doing. It's evolving, we're evolving with it. I think my biggest challenge, certainly from an actuarial and data science perspective, and not to go too off on a tangent, but it's been alluded to a number of times today, is just the attraction and retention of talent, because they are skill sets that are highly sought after, not just in the insurance industry, but beyond as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's a skills gap that we're seeing. I think that's actually influencing a lot of the decisions that we're having to make, because again, I go back to, I've been working in innovation and technology for I've been fortunate to do that since I've been with the NAIC the last 5 years, and you see a continuum, right? You want to understand everything that's in the black box. I want to get in there. I want to dive down. The reality is one that's probably not necessary, and we probably never going to, because every model is going to be different. I can understand one, but there's going to be 60,000 models that are going to be tweaked differently, and they're going to evolve over time. But also the ability, the skills ability to do that is going to be very, very challenging. I'm going to shift gear, Tracie. I'm going to ask you a question in here, and I hope you don't make me want to throw away my cell phone. But it's, can you talk to us a little bit? Well, one, everything we're relying on is relied on data, right? And so it's a broader scope for hackers to get involved in. They put our businesses at risk for cyber attacks. So can you tell us what you would consider to be the most significant cyber risk in the insurance industry, and how you suggest insurance companies and regulators work together to address that risk?
So ransomware has been really what's been plaguing the industry for the last couple of years, and that activity is continuing, and there was significant adjustments in underwriting last year to address the ransomware risk. And I think we learned a lot from the loss activity that came in 19 and 20. And you saw a response from the industry and starting to change underwriting and pricing to reflect this elevated risk. So that's one of the key areas right now. The other is systemic risk, and what we look at are things that we call ripple events, where there's an event that might happen at a vendor that is either a data breach where they have data of many other organizations, so all the data of those organizations is disclosed. You have multiple organizations that are impacted, or you might have a ransomware event against a service provider, and then all those companies that rely on that service provider are also experiencing a business interruption. So this type of common aggregators of services or data being impacted and then resulting in many claims for the industry. Those are two of the largest concerns right now. We can take the concern around war in as well, but the war concern is really the same as the ripple event. It's that there's all this activity and it impacts organizations that then impact many other organizations. And so these are two key areas that the industry needs to be underwriting, and underwriting in a very detailed way. I absolutely think it's possible. I think we've already proven that it is possible that we could get to a granular level on the claims that we're seeing and be able to identify best practices and enforce best practices and incentivize best practices through premiums and capacity. But I think partnering with regulators, one of the things that we can do is certainly raise awareness, but also to make sure that carriers are underwriting this risk at the level that it needs to be underwritten at, and that they are capturing the right data so that we can analyze these exposures going forward, that we know what the ripple events are, that we know who our clients are dependent on, that we have a better understanding of the supply chain. That information needs to be captured so that carriers can better have better modeling for their risk and how exposed are we to particular vendors. So, we do get a lot of questions from regulators throughout the world, a lot of surveys we've been filling out in different countries about affirmative cyber or claim activity, and those questions are extremely varied. They're not the same at all or even similar in most cases. So I think we need to figure out what are the questions that we really need to be asking and driving the industry towards, and it's definitely around granular level underwriting and data and supporting that data capture so that so carriers can start to come together with the type of data that we're looking for to better analyze it.
Yeah, I think it's certainly going to take cooperative work to do that, and it's going to continue to evolve. So I think you're.
That is the big challenge, that cyber is so. It's constantly evolving, and data from 6 months ago is definitely not valid. So there's a lot of discussion about even in government about maintaining databases of claim information, loss information from cyber attacks. It is going to be a huge challenge to be able to, the carriers are doing it, but in order to get regulators on board and others to be following it in real time and being able to make those adjustments, that is definitely a real challenge.
Well, I think we've seen, it's nice to have seen the shift, at least I've seen it in the last 5 years, not to keep going back to that, but it's, initially it was kind of, okay, there is cyber risk, okay, sure. I mean, even North Dakota, I'm a very rural state. I think Dean mentioned he's a rural state. We think we put him to shame for rural. But even in North Dakota now, we've got our small insurers who understand that there is cyber risk out there. They may not understand it fully and understand the level of it, but being able to at least recognize that is a big step as we continue to evolve, and it'll keep evolving.
Yeah, that's why awareness, also partnering with regulators on awareness I mentioned, because there is still confusion of what cyber exposure is, what affirmative cyber is, the difference between a physical cyber event and a non-physical cyber event. There's still a lot of misunderstanding in the market, and we need to really, come together on some of these terms.
Yep, exactly. So Peter, I'm going to turn back to you. In addition to your role as a professor at the Connecticut School of Law, you're also an NAIC-funded consumer rep. We touched a little bit on transparency earlier, and just curious if you believe that's the biggest issue facing consumers around big data, or if there's another one that you want to touch on.
I mean, I think transparency is important, although, as Dorothy said, it's a difficult, it's going to take on different meanings in the area of big data, which we'll probably talk upon later. I don't think it's the number one issue, at least in terms of defining, I don't have enough pieces of paper to read or online to tell me what I need to know, because no one's going to read that stuff anyway. Almost no one. But I think I think one of the big problems, and this gets to price optimization, but also the points made about trust. I mean, we all know, everyone in this room knows that there's no industry that relies more on the need for trust. Insurance is a money for a promise. I need to trust that when I pay you the premium and I have a covered claim months, years, decades later, that I'll get what my beneficiaries will, not only the company will have the ability to pay, but the willingness to. So that trust, and big data can really, I think, aid in that trust, but it can also make it, and this leads to transparency, make it much more opaque, the whole underwriting process. And I think that's where we're, at least now, much more likely. The difficulty in understanding the underwriting factors, the complexity of the underwriting factors, which consumers may not use that precise term, but what are my rates? What are they being priced on? What can I do to change it? And increasingly the use of more sophisticated factors, such as education, social media, or whatever, as a rating factor. What can I do, if that's different than I could drive better? So there's understanding and the ability to affect the rates, and then also, which often doesn't get talked about much, claims. That's not a new concern. That's always the number one, I think, complaint that consumers have, always present, to regulators and others. But the use of big data can make that process, I think, more opaque, or it could have the potential to make it much more transparent.
Well, and you also got to even dig into, and this will kind of lead into our next subtopic, is where's that data coming from? We're seeing a big influx in third-party vendors that are providing data to the industry, and it's frustrating at times for even as a regulator to be able to get in and to see, okay, where is this data coming from? Is it valuable? And then you got to understand, and then try to drive that into the consumer's mindset of we're all consumers in here, but we may not, there's a lack of understanding of even the insurance products in there. So then diving down into here's the data that's driving the product decisions. There is a big education wave there. But on the third-party vendor issue, so Dorothy, I'm going to look at you here. Can you provide some perspective on how insurance companies are blending these, the traditional sets of data with the new ones, the third-party kind of the telematics stuff? And then do you have any concerns about the accuracy or the completeness of these data sets? And if so, what can we be doing about it?
Yeah, so you do see companies blending third-party data with traditional rating variables. I think the problem with third-party data is that it's unregulated. If that data proves to be, bad data, give a bad result, I don't think you can hold the third parties responsible for that. No one can really, and I think an even bigger problem with third-party data is that it's proprietary. If you try to ask a third-party vendor, oh, how did you develop that data set? Where did you get the data from? You're not going to get an answer, right? They're going to say, well, that's proprietary. That's our secret sauce. And I think that's very problematic because the way you handle missingness in data can affect the distributions on different variables, and that can introduce bias. I mean, when we take a look at, how did they actually, fill in someone's age, for example? How did they do that? Did they just assume the mean? Did they assume the median? Did they base it on some kind of empirical research? How are they filling in the blanks in these data sets? You also have some third parties that are using surveys to collect data, and they're packaging survey results and selling them to consumers. And oftentimes those surveys are based on a college population, which is not very representative. So, I mean, these are the kinds of questions you need to ask. The other thing is, some of this third-party data was developed for one purpose, but then it's being used in, actuarial modeling, which is a different purpose. And when you construct a data set, you usually have a set of questions in mind that are going to guide you as to what type of data elements you're going to include in that data set. Well, it's not really correct to just package that and sell that to someone else without telling them, what was the intention behind putting this data set? What kinds of questions did you expect it to answer? And is using it in an actuarial model going to give you the answer that you're looking for? Because if I were to develop a data set for a different purpose, I might include different variables. I mean, that's just how you build a data set. You start out with the questions, then you find the data elements to answer those questions. But if the way it's being used in an actuarial model doesn't have anything to do with those questions, it may not be the right data to include.
So Tracie, I know this was of interest to you as well. I'd be curious your thoughts on the third-party usage and things like that.
So in cyber, the industry is using a lot of third-party data, and I do think that there's, I'm not a data scientist and looking at it the way it was just being described, but there's some data that I think is, it's partly reliable. There's some that they are collecting, from, you do have to understand the sources. I do find that on the cyber side, when we're asking these companies how they get the data, where they get it from, they actually are telling us and giving us some information about that and insight. But a lot of the data that we're using is data that's seen on external networks. And that data is really there and it's publicly available, and you just need companies that are scraping it. But when you get that data, it could be misleading. So you have to look further, and there's other tools that you can use to get that raw data and then do your own analysis to see what's real, what's a false positive, what might be related to, like for example, with a hotel, if you're looking at external data, you'll see a lot of malware and vulnerabilities on the network, but that's because they have a guest Wi-Fi in the hotel that everyone's logging onto, and that's not as controlled. That's very different than the corporate network. The corporate network is what we're concerned about, where the data is for the organization. So you have to be able to make that distinction when you're using that kind of data to understand and use it properly. But I think that some of the data providers in the cyberspace, there's some very good data points within it. You'll see a lot of companies that are giving scoring. I don't know that the score matters. It's really some hidden data points that are within what they're providing. But there are ways to check that data yourself. Use the core data points, not kind of these summarized scores. So I do think it's helpful, and we've had a lot of success with using that to identify critical vulnerabilities that we know need to lead to losses, working with our clients to get those vulnerabilities cleaned up or malware off the network. And we've had situations where we've seen attackers in a network and was able to stop it before it got to the actual ransomware deployment, even though the data was already exfiltrated. So yeah, I think these tools have been really great in the cyberspace, and I think we've helped many, many clients avoid loss, and thus the carriers avoid loss. But I think the key is, you can't really look at the summary. You really have to look at kind of the individual data points within it, and then verify that yourself if those are things you're going to rely upon.
Good points, good points. So Domhnall, I'm going to come back to the transparency a little bit. What should the role of the regulator be to support consumer transparency, and especially around that ethical use of big data and AI? And are there any best practices in this area, and if so, what do they kind of look like?
Okay. So I did mention earlier on the project that we have ongoing at the moment with the support of the European Commission to look at data ethics when it comes to using big data in insurance. And I suppose at the moment we're at the stage where we're just trying to establish what are the actual practices out there, and then we will try and identify what the response to that should be. We have certainly seen the blending of non-traditional data, such as things that have already been mentioned, telematics, geocoding, social media, for example, to supplement more traditional data, of which is obviously already large volumes. I mean, it's been spoken about already that insurance has always been a big user of data. So we've certainly seen that. We have seen some really good practices, to be fair, as part of that work. So, for example, we have seen data ethicists employed and used to actually think about how this data is going to be used and what policies are going to be used. So something that Dorothy mentioned earlier on, we have seen actuarial teams dismiss those kind of spurious correlations that might come up. So why is town A more likely to renew than identical town B? So we've certainly seen that happen as well, although not necessarily escalated up to the C-suite that it becomes a corporate policy. So it's almost like the actuarial teams themselves are self-regulating this. But we've also seen some bad practices. We've already spoken, obviously, about the price optimization. And it's just really unacceptable that firms will allow AI or machine learning or whatever to be allowed to run without any consideration of the consequences and without even any process in place to examine where that might be caught. And I suppose then, so that you got the good, the bad, and then what I kind of call the just not good enough, because what we've been talking about to firms is around data ethics, and a lot of what we get back a lot of the time, something you've mentioned, is privacy and they talk to us about GDPR and all the things they have in place to do with that. And I'm going, well, okay, that's fine, and it's wonderful, and the GDPR is an enormously valuable piece of legislation. But nonetheless, compliance with that will not necessarily get you to an ethical spot when it comes to use of big data in insurance. So, as I said, we're looking at that at the moment. I don't want to prejudge the outcome of it. It could be principles, it could be rules, it could be I don't know where we'll go on that. I do like the idea of a lot of been talked about the public-private partnership, the sharing of information. I think there might be something of that as well. There's a lot of that done on climate. It could be a good place to do it here as well. But I think ultimately for me, where a lot of this is still going to come back to is about behaviour and culture in firms themselves. And if you have got that right at the top, the tone from the top right, and proper policies in place, these things shouldn't happen. It's not that they can't and don't, but they shouldn't happen in the same way. And it simply isn't, for me, sort of acceptable that firms were allowed to happen without any checks and balances in the system.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing a shift within. Traditionally, there's a give and take and a rub between a regulator and a company, and I very much understand that and know that. But I think we're seeing the need for that wall to come down a little bit. We're seeing, like I mentioned in the opening, we're doing some surveys at the NAIC. They're anonymous. We're able to aggregate the data and kind of get that together to hopefully encourage that truthful discussion, because frankly, we assume there's some good and some bad out there, right? And we want to know what the good is so we can tell everybody here's a proper way to do it. So it kind of leads to the next question. This is kind of for everybody, but Peter, I'm going to probably start it with you. Is there's always that push and pull between regulation and innovation, and can they coexist? So looking for your thoughts on, one, can they coexist, and what are some of the regulatory barriers impeding innovation, and your thoughts on how do we move forward in making changes to these standards while preserving those necessary consumer protections that I know we all certainly care about?
I mean, yes, I mean, in theory, and I think in practice, they absolutely can coexist. In that sense, it's sort of a false dichotomy. But in practice, it hasn't been the case. It actually, I think the industry here has been its own worst enemy at times. In part, with claiming that even the most basic data is confidential, it's proprietary, it can't be shared. It's hard to trust innovation if you don't know who is, what neutral party, what regulator has looked at it. And transparency here is important, but it's not the only issue. I think, or we could look at transparency in terms of innovation as two things. One, what information as a policyholder, as a consumer, do I need or should I have? But two, and I think increasingly so, is I'm not going to understand the models, never have been able to, most consumers, certainly me, and certainly not now. I'm not going to know whether there's been proxy discrimination, whether these models are accurate, how my data has been collected, and how it's been used. I'm not going to know that. And you can give me all the disclosures you want, and I'm not going to know much of that. But what I can, and this is the second part of transparency, I need to be able to rely on the fact that there's a regulator who has done that work in insurance. And that's a form of transparency. So the data, the information that you're able to get from the industry to regulate and to look at these things is critically important to me and my trust in the industry, always a consumer's industry, because I have to rely on someone else. Even if I don't know what's going on, and particularly when I don't know what's going on, I have to be able to rely not on the industry to tell me everything's fine and this is good, but that someone has looked at that. And I think that's true in many areas, but it's particularly true in insurance because of the trust factor. Where I think innovation, where innovation can really move us beyond, and I think you mentioned this briefly, is understanding what does disclosure mean? What does transparency mean? It can't simply be more paper forms, but big data and innovation, they can inform us. They can develop a set of best practices of using technology to provide meaningful, understandable disclosures to consumers in ways other than adding to the terms and conditions. And that's something that I think would be a major innovation. I mean, regulation, a sandbox can be fine, but so often, at least what we hear or could interpret, is that the innovations they want could just as easily violate basic premises of insurance, and protection, and that's not worth innovation. But it doesn't have to be that way, but the industry needs to be much more open with regulators, if not their policyholders.
So, Domhnall, curious.
I'd like to add to what Peter said, because someone earlier mentioned that they wish there was a fast lane for getting approvals. And I'm on the NAIC model review team, and we review advanced statistical models and filings. And I think companies can help themselves get in that fast lane by giving a complete filing. We often have to go back and ask, well, what does this mean? They left out definitions. If they can make a filing complete, and we even gave a presentation on speed to market, how you can improve your filings. If they just documented and were transparent in the filing, that would go a long ways towards building that trust between industry and regulators, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's certainly a two-way street. I mean, and so Domhnall, I'm curious on your take as a supervisor and on how that relationship works over in Ireland in terms of between companies and regulators, and any of your thoughts on what Dorothy or Peter just said?
Well, the analogy was Tim used earlier on about the fast lane. I don't know what the trend is in the US, but in Europe we're increasingly going towards self-service. So I'm not sure how that'll work in the regulatory world. I'm sure Tim might be quite happy with it. When it comes to innovation, the thing about it is I think we always need to focus on what is actually the problem that firms are trying to solve. So we get a lot of criticism for, perhaps not, we have an innovation hub, we've tried that, we're certainly considering, a sandbox, digital sandbox, and the things we're looking at. But increasingly we kind of find people come to us and they say, we really want this, we really want InsurTech to work, we really want FinTech to work. And our question always back is, well, what for? What is exactly is the problem that you're trying to solve? And that isn't always entirely, and I mean that from a consumer perspective. What is it? What is this risk that you're looking to insure in a particular way, and how you're going to use this to get there? And it's not always entirely clear to us. Sometimes they're trying to actually peddle something that isn't actually needed. The risk doesn't really exist in the first place. We authorized our first fully digital insurer last year, a company called Companion, which basically, if you go up in the Eiffel Tower and it starts to rain, or you want to go in the Eiffel Tower and it starts to rain, you don't want to go anymore, they're refunding your ticket. But basically it's all entirely digitalized, so if it starts to rain, it comes down, you get the money back into your account, which I think is a good product, and it's really interesting. But unless you can actually laser focus in on it, and is what you're trying to solve, and convince us that it's there, you could do it through innovation. The discussions can become quite frustrating on both sides.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, I think the self-service lane is interesting. I think it's always interesting push and pull and tug and pull, and it gets back to that willingness, like Dorothy mentioned, to give us the complete filing and have that discussion and move forward. It's because it's oftentimes we get well, you didn't ask for it. It's like, well, we don't know what we're asking for sometimes because it's all so relatively new. So, and back to your point about, I've said a number of times to companies that have come into my office, said, if you can come and explain to me how this is good for the consumer, you're going to be on a much better step forward versus how cool this new tool is and how amazing it is. It's at the end of the day, that's what we are as regulators and supervisors. Is that's who I report to. That's who you report to. Is how is this impacting our consumers? I'm going to shift gears just a little bit right into the heart of cybersecurity. So Tracie, this is coming for you. And so we're going to shift and talk a little bit about cybersecurity events and things like that. And so once an event or a breach has occurred, can you provide a perspective on what a company should immediately do to address their systems, engage with regulators, and engage with consumers regarding that event?
Sure, and one of the questions that's coming in from the audience is a little related to this about should cyber programs be focused on mitigation and response rather than prevention? And prevention is significantly important, but the mitigation and response to an event is also extremely important. And before the event happens, organizations really need to be preparing for how they're going to respond, doing tabletop exercises, getting the right people in the room that are going to have to make the decision and make sure they know who the decision makers are. it's very important to know ahead of time who your regulators are and have discussions with them, as well as with law enforcement. And those relationships should be set up beforehand. Organizations should have a plan and they should practice it. And the response to a breach absolutely impacts the total cost and ultimate impact of an event when it actually does happen. So, you should involve your carriers in that as well, notifying your carrier right away. Carriers really bring to the table expertise in that they've handled thousands of claims across the world. We have relationships with many vendors and know how to make sure that we're using the right vendors for the right events to get the most effective results. So, it is really all that preparation work in order to make the breach go smoothly, the handling of the breach go smoothly as possible and have the best possible outcome. But prevention, to the question from the audience, the prevention is hugely important. And cyber events they're not unavoidable. When we have a cyber event, it's very predictable about how it was going to happen. I mentioned before about the data that we're purchasing. There is, for certain ransomware variants, there's certain malware that if you have that malware on your network, that's the malware that's what's being exploited. And if you have that, then you're very likely to have an attack from this ransomware gang, and the attack happens the exact same way every single time. So this really isn't that mysterious. I know it's a lot if you're not in the space to know about and understand. But there could be things that are unavoidable. I mean, we certainly think that if a nation state is targeting an organization, that might be something that is unavoidable. But there are controls that organizations can have in place, and that's why everything in cybersecurity, I firmly believe in underwriting, and that's an area where carriers and regulators can partner to determine the right level of underwriting, push that through, make sure the regulators, when they're asking the carriers questions, that it's around these questions that really impact risk and how we're managing risk and how we can help our clients manage risk. So I think that we absolutely can get there, and organizations have to have the right controls in place. We need to be underwriting and incentivizing those controls, but definitely mitigation and prevention, mitigation and response, practicing that, knowing your partners at the time that happens, those are all very important factors as well.
So would you, and we've got the NAIC Cyber Data Security Model Act, and there's a number of them that are out there. Congress is working on things as well. I think I know your answer to this question, but so the response, what would you say about the timing of that stuff, right? So there's generally timelines in there. It's within 72 hours for the NAIC to report that. And what we've kind of told, at least my industry in North Dakota, is that the sooner the better, because we can deploy resources, you can deploy resources. So the days of watching a cyber attack happen for, let's say, a small to mid-sized insurance company and trying to figure it out on your own is probably not the best idea. I'm assuming that.
Yeah, definitely not the best idea, because there's so many, there's so many experts and people to help you that have a huge amount of experience. I mean, the industry's handled thousands and thousands of claims. I mean, you buying an insurance product, it's smart just to buy an insurance product just because you're getting access to all that intelligence, and hopefully no other organization outside of an insurance company will have had experience handling as many events as insurance companies have. So there's vendors that know how to identify right from the beginning the most effective way to recover from a breach. You don't start doing things on your own. You could really be wasting time with that, causing more loss, more business downtime, more issues. You absolutely want to get the law enforcement involved, regulators involved, your insurance carrier involved. There's so much expertise that's available to you. But the timelines, I think sometimes the timelines are in dispute, so it depends on kind of the language around that. You do want to get people involved immediately, but then there's some reporting timelines, and a lot of times when we see clients come out immediately after the breach and make a statement, it's usually not correct. It does take a couple of days, a couple of weeks to figure out what kind of data, was taken, how much data, make sure that the incident is contained. And sometimes we find that in some rules, it's, report in 3 days, what happened, who was impacted. That's very challenging because no one knows in 3 days, so you would get wrong information at that time.
So Domhnall, curious for your perspective on what's going on in Ireland, and how are you guys responding to some of these evolving threats, especially given the current situation in Ukraine?
Yeah, it was fascinating to get the insight
Yeah.
from the General this morning. But as he pointed out, this goes back a long time. It's not just about the invasion. It goes back to Crimea in 2014 and even Georgia before that. And in reality, Russia, China, North Korea have been engaged in a cyber war of sorts, trying to create the incidents that we're talking about. And in Russia particularly, it wasn't all state sponsored, but it was certainly state tolerated. And one of the issues we had in Ireland last year was we have a National Health Service, our health service executive at the height of the pandemic was actually subject to a ransomware attack. So people actually died as a consequence of that. And you're sitting at home thinking, well, what sort of country allows that to happen to a tiny, largely defenseless country? And then you see the tanks roll into Ukraine, you kind of know the type of people we're dealing with. I think in terms of, what can we do? It was really interesting actually listening to Eric this morning, because he said two things that kind of really chimed with me. And the first one was, as supervisors, we need to be absolutely crystal clear with firms. Our expectation is continuity of service. That has to be paramount. So even though you may be a victim in these particular cases, the continuity of service is absolutely vital. So that may be helpful, it may not be helpful, but it is the reality. That is the expectation. In terms of things beyond the things that we have done to try and help in this particular instance, and the thing about the attack we had last year. It's an ill wind that blows no good. It did have the impact of that. It highlighted it to firms and people about their own kind of cyber threat to them. So it really was useful in that sense. But the types of things that we've done, as far back as 2016, we issued cross-industry guidance on cybersecurity. In 2019, we put in place the Tiber network, which framework actually applies or provides for us to do ethical hacking of financial services companies. And I think in the last year, at both European and national level, we put in place an initiative around cyber information and intelligence sharing, which allows public-private partnership of incident reports, etc. And this is something, again, that Eric alluded to this morning. He's talking about the FBI, briefings from them. We're talking to our own national cybersecurity data center. We're talking to the NAICIIForum, which is the European equivalent of that. We're talking to Europol, which is the EU's crime-fighting agency. And we're highlighting the issues to firms that they're highlighting to us. And I think that is probably the best way forward that we can help firms in this particular instance.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and it highlights, I think, some of the work that we're doing here domestically in the United States is, we're running tabletop exercises. I know different state insurance departments are doing that. We haven't done ours yet. We're going to join with probably the other Dakota, South Dakota, as Gary so affectionately mentioned, to do one, because I think to Tracie's point, it's getting some of that, not even muscle memory, just getting through an exercise to know what to do if something happens, right? And so that's, I think, a space that we see as regulators where we can help connect those dots. I'm not going to be able to turn off the ransomware attack, but I can help you find what we need to do and move forward. We've got about 7.5 minutes left, so we're going to move to some of the audience questions. So these are going to be kind of a grab bag, so feel free to anybody jump in on them. The first one, it says, data shows that there's a correlation between race and mortality. If the data does not reflect racial identity, but outcomes display risk disparity by race, is it illegal? So that's whoever.
Not necessarily. Let's assume there's no intent. It is a factor that turns out to. It's not by definition illegal, even with a disparate impact standard, and maybe the term itself, disparate impact, isn't all of that helpful. Because then once it's been demonstrated there is a disparate impact, which is a neutral term in itself, it affects a group or ethnicity or protected class differently, then the question is, paraphrasing, what is the business justification for that risk? Are there other ways of achieving similar or same outcome, risk calculation, risk precision, without having to use that risk? And then, and that's where part of the debate is. So it's not necessarily illegal. It's a question of, and illegal almost may not even be the best term, though it's the one I probably would use offhand, because it's the issue is, once it's proven, do you need to use that factor? And what the other factors you can do. At least that's the traditional test. Insurance regulators have another goal, or another regulatory tool that many don't, which is even if it is actuarially fair and more predictive than another race, that doesn't mean you have to use it. You get to ban or prohibit or allow and encourage risk classifications. There's plenty of reasons outside of risk precision why race should not be used. And it doesn't necessarily have much to do with insurance, it has to do with our country, in our world, and our history.
Yeah, no, I think that you hit on a great point there. Anybody else have anything to add to that, or we can jump into the next one is, how should we think about data sources that are predictive of loss, but also correlated with protected class status? A similar question, and how do you strike that balance? It's somewhat to your point, Peter, that you made, but any thoughts on how we strike that balance?
I think it's a political question, I think. I mean, and I
I
mean
think that's why
that
it's
in the
on
most,
there.
it's a public policy question, I think. Because ultimately, it's, who strikes that balance there shouldn't be the vendor, the insurance company, even the policyholder. How we shift risks and how we subsidize risks ultimately is a really important public question, which means it has to be a political question. The best example I can think of, we don't allow in the United States finally, essentially in most health insurance plans, you can't rate on pre-existing conditions or health status. Those are incredibly predictive qualifications. They're not we don't allow them, the government doesn't, the law doesn't allow them, not because of the lack of precision, but because, or predictability, because there's other values more important there. We want to pool those risks. And that decision has to be made by a public entity, by government.
But I'll just add too that, sometimes these correlations can be artifacts of the model. If they have the wrong target variable that and it hasn't been well researched, you can get this type of result. That's why it's really important to look at these target variables that are in models, look at every variable, and figure out how is that variable tied to some kind of policy or practice that is discriminatory, and then probably clean up your model that way.
Maybe just add some sort of thought on this. From an Irish perspective, not dissimilar to what you just said, Peter, I mean, we have, when it comes to health insurance, we've open enrollment and community rating. So we also banned quite early on in the kind of genesis of genetic testing, we banned the use of that in life insurance underwriting. So you can make those decisions. Whether they're always the best for the industry or not, I don't know. They're policy decisions, absolutely, but whether they're the best for the industry, I don't know. And what really struck me when that question came through earlier on, particularly in relation to race, I mean, there's a right answer to that. And it comes back to what I talked about earlier about behaviour and culture. Just do the right thing. That's what a pool is for.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing some of the ability for the insurance industry to help shape some of that societal change as well. And so I think it gets into what are the societal goals, what are the fancy math goals, I guess, is another term. And
what are the mediating variables? Because that's another part of the problem.
So Tracie, I want to come back to you and to talk a little bit more about the cybersecurity marketplace and how is that changing and growing, and what are the claims experience like in that cybersecurity marketplace, and kind of some of the products and features. I think that's certainly I'm interested in what you're seeing out there in the new products and features in the cyber market and kind of how it's growing and what's changing within it.
Okay. So the industry has been just going through a lot of change as a result of, we had many years, product's been around since the late 90s, we've had many years of extreme profitability. Ransomware came along, and because of the frequency of ransomware and the severity of it and the frequency of severity, it really impacted the market, and the market wasn't really pricing. Prior to ransomware, we had 4 years of rate decline because the loss activity was good, but then the attack pattern changes and we're dealing with a real life adversary, and we had to change the underwriting and increase premiums to reflect the change in the threat landscape, which is what we're subject to in cyber. So that has really changed the industry in that, kind of the way that we're underwriting and how we're looking at claims, and that we're more concerned about data, we're more concerned about external data, and kind of bringing all these things together, bringing insights to our clients. So these are some of the changes, but because it's really an evolving space, and everyone's learning, even the insurance industry is working very closely with the cybersecurity industry, and we spend much of our time with the cybersecurity industry as we do with the insurance industry, and relying on experts there. And even in that area where these are the companies that make these tools and understand them, there's still uncertainty about risk and what products really work and how much they mitigate risk and things like that. So we're all trying to figure that out together. And so as we do that, what you're seeing happen is that insurance companies are taking different directions. And I remember even a few years ago having insurance industry meetings with Treasury, and the question was, how can we bring this industry together? How can we all make decisions the same? And we were like, wow, we're so far away from that. And I thought by this time, especially with this claim activity, we'd start to get closer. But what I really see happening in the market is that carriers are actually going in different directions. We're underwriting differently. We're thinking that different data points are important, and they are all important. Like one company might think multi-factor authentication is the most important. Another company thinks open RDP is the most important. Another company thinks service accounts in domain admin is the most important. Those are all important, but when we're taking these different directions and what we're emphasizing, what we're underwriting, where we're collecting data, that's problematic. We're also seeing problematic for the brokers and clients. What we're also seeing is language development. The things that I mentioned before, systemic risk and war, and actually it was just touched on a little bit about there being a death as a result of a cyber event, but bodily injury and property damage, how is that going to be covered rising out of a cyber event? Carriers are taking different positions on those things and really diverging. And I was, more recently, we're seeing new war exclusions come into the market, and the market is definitely not in agreement with it. And some are more limiting, some are more broad. So there really is still all this, just different approach. So it's very challenging marketplace. I know there were so many questions you had within your question, and I know I didn't have a lot of time. I know I didn't hit on all of them, but that's what's happening in the market. The claims activity, it's ransomware. We do think that's been a little bit quiet. Traditionally, ransomware has been quiet in the first quarter because a lot of it comes out of Eastern Europe and there's Orthodox holidays. And so we do see it go down. We also had obviously the conflict in Ukraine and Russia, and so people are displaced, maybe networks are down, focused on other activities. But if you look at the activity of this first quarter versus first quarter 2021, it's up significantly. So while we sometimes hear people saying that ransomware activity has pulled back a little bit in the first quarter, it pulled back from fourth quarter. But fourth quarter is always the biggest quarter. And then if you look at first quarter 2022 versus 2021, it's a big increase. So I don't really think we're any place where ransomware is calming down. These actors are making a huge amount of money. It's totally easy. They're getting away with it. That's here to stay for a long time. But the other types of claims that we're seeing is we still see data breaches. There's still big data breaches going on. Data breaches just will never be as frequent because you're selling the data in the dark web and there's only so much you could sell. It's supply and demand. So you might have a few big ones. We might have a few big that impact the industry, but it's never going to I don't think it's going to make the industry unprofitable because there's just limited. The frequency of them, I feel, would be limited. We are seeing, cyber policies cover privacy, so we're seeing a lot more BIPA claims. We're seeing some things come in as a result of, like a GDPR investigation. So there are some privacy events that are going on as well, but it's still ransomware driving the dollars. Maybe not. Ransomware is probably about 20% of claim activity, but it's maybe 80% of the dollars that are being spent right now. So that's where we are on claims.
Yeah, I've got a bunch more questions, but I'm getting the blinking red light up here.
Sorry.
So I hope you can join me in thanking our panel. We had a great panel, a great discussion. I hope we provided some clarity to what is an evolving and probably a little bit more gray area at times, but I want to thank our panelists for being up here. Thank you.
Thank you.